Let's get right into it. Number 10, the hand cannon. Picture this. You're a medieval soldier, standing on a battlefield that smells like sweat, mud, and fear. You're armed with basically a metal pipe strapped to a stick. That's the hand cannon, the OG of firearms. It was supposed to be revolutionary, but in practice, it was like trying to scare your enemies by setting off fireworks in your own face. The design was beautifully stupid. You'd load some gunpowder into the barrel, shove in a projectile, anything vaguely round would do, like a stone, lead ball, or probably last night's dinner if you were desperate, and then light it with a match or burning stick. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds kind of awesome, you're right. Until you remember, medieval metallurgy was about as reliable as your Wi-Fi during a thunderstorm. These hand cannons had the tendency to, well, explode. Not in the send a bullet into the enemy way, but in the turn your hands into red confetti way. Sometimes the ignition hole would misfire, or the powder wouldn't ignite evenly, or the barrel would just straight up burst like a tin can in a microwave. So instead of striking fear into the enemy, you'd mostly strike fear into your own side. Psychologically, they were terrifying, just not for the people you wanted them to be terrifying for. Imagine being told, here's your new weapon. It might kill the enemy, or it might kill you. Good luck. It's like Russian roulette, but every chamber has a different way of rooting your day. And yet, this clunky device marked the beginning of gunpowder warfare, the ancestor to every rifle, pistol, and cannon we know today. So yes, the hand cannon was forgotten not because it didn't work, but because it worked too unpredictably. It was like having a chainsaw that occasionally decided to turn on you mid-cut. A great idea on paper, a horrible nightmare in reality. Basically, the hand cannon was medieval humanity saying, we're not scared enough of death. Let's add explosions to the mix. Number 9, the Puckle Gun. Fast forward a few centuries, and humans got cocky. Enter the Puckle Gun, invented in 1718. This thing looked like a tripod-mounted cannon, except it was basically a flintlock revolver for people with too much ambition and not enough practical engineering skills. Here's the sales pitch: a gun that could fire multiple shots before needing to reload. Revolutionary, right? That's because revolvers and machine guns didn't exist yet. The Puckle Gun was meant to guard ships, deter boarding parties, and prove once and for all that colonial powers had way too much free time. But here's the kicker. It didn't just shoot regular bullets. The inventor, James Puckle, actually designed two types of ammunition. One was the normal, boring round bullet, great for shooting Christians apparently. The other was square bullets. Yes, square. Because he claimed square bullets were more effective against uncivilized enemies like the Ottoman Turks. Nothing says technological innovation than trying to reinvent geometry as a war crime. So why didn't this terrifying proto-machine gun take off? Because it barely worked. The flintlock mechanism was temperamental, the rotating cylinder jammed constantly, and the whole thing was more expensive than it was practical. Soldiers hated it, captains hated it, even the investors hated it, which is saying something because rich guys in powdered wigs usually loved anything labeled deadlier than ever. Psychologically, though, the Puckle Gun was terrifying in concept. Imagine seeing some guy roll up with what looked like a tripod death machine, boasting about his square bullets. You'd be confused, terrified, and maybe a little insulted that someone thought you didn't deserve round ammunition. In the end, the Puckle Gun was too ambitious for its time. It promised the Gatling gun a century early, but delivered a glorified musket that couldn't even handle the breeze. It wasn't forgotten because it was harmless. It was forgotten because it was impractical, absurd, and just a little racist with its square bullet agenda.
Number 8. The Nock Gun. Now imagine being on an 18th century British warship. The cannons are booming, the deck is slick with seawater, and probably a little blood. And suddenly, here comes your buddy with the Nock Gun. This thing was a 7-barreled musket, designed so you could unleash 7 bullets in one fiery blast. Sounds epic, right? Like something Rambo would carry if he were into powdered wigs. Except here's the problem. 7 barrels means 7 times the recoil. When fired, the Nock Gun basically tried to punch its owner's shoulder into another dimension. Sailors who fired it often ended up with bruised or even broken bones. And because of the massive recoil, accuracy was laughable. You'd aim at the enemy and hit, well, hopefully something. Maybe the mast, maybe your own friend's hat, who knows? It was meant for clearing enemy decks during boarding actions, but on cramped, chaotic ships, the giant muzzle flash from 7 simultaneous shots was more likely to set your own sails on fire than hit anyone useful. Imagine your captain yelling, "Fire!" and suddenly the main deck is covered in smoke, half the crew's deaf, and the sails are smoldering. Congrats, you just defeated yourself. Psychologically, the Nock Gun terrified both the enemy and the shooter. To the enemy, it looked like some monstrous multi-barreled beast of a weapon. To the shooter, it looked like a one-way ticket to the infirmary. Soldiers eventually learned to hide when the guy with the Nock Gun showed up, because friendly fire wasn't just possible, it was guaranteed. So the Nock Gun faded into obscurity, too terrifying to use, too impractical to keep, but just cool enough to show up in movies like The Patriot, where historical accuracy takes a nap. Essentially, it was the original looks cool on paper, destroys your rotator cuff in practice kind of weapon.
Number 7. The Crumbloff. Now for a World War II oddity. Picture being a German soldier in the 1940s, told you'd be getting a groundbreaking new weapon, the Crumbloff. Translation? Curved barrel. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. A gun with a barrel bent at 30, 45, or even 90 degrees, so you could shoot around corners without exposing yourself. It sounds like cheat codes for real life, right? Sneak around a bunker corner and bam, you're a Nazi magician. Except physics exists. Bullets don't like being forced to make sharp turns at high speed. They'd often shatter, ricochet inside the barrel, or just tumble out with the stopping power of a rubber band. And because the stress on the barrel was enormous, the weapon itself cracked and broke after about 200 shots, which in wartime is about 199 shots too few. Soldiers didn't trust it. They'd get handed a Crumbloff attachment and immediately think, do I want to shoot the enemy or do I want to shoot myself in the face with bullet shrapnel? Not exactly a confidence booster. Psychologically, though, it was nightmare fuel. Imagine being an Allied soldier and suddenly hearing gunfire coming from a wall, only to realize some guy with a bent barrel just sprayed bullets around a corner. It was the stuff of horror movies, until you realized most of those bullets didn't actually hit anything. In the end, the Crumbloff was abandoned. Too risky, too unreliable, and too terrifying for the user. Basically, it turned the concept of a gun into the world's most stressful plumbing system.
Number 6. The wind and firewheel. Let's roll way back to ancient China, where inventors were mixing martial arts philosophy with weapons that look like toys but can end your life. Enter the wind and firewheels. Imagine 2 sharpened metal rings, about the size of dinner plates, with flame-shaped protrusions along the edges. They look like something you'd buy at a Renaissance fair, except these weren't for cosplay. They were meant to shred you into ribbons. Warriors wielded one in each hand, and they could slash, block, or even throw them, which sounds awesome until you realize these things were also great at slashing, blocking, and shredding your own arms. If your technique wasn't perfect, congratulations, you just performed a one-man juggling act called Why Am I Missing Fingers Now? The psychology here is fascinating. Humans love symmetry, and there's something terrifying about seeing someone whirl around with 2 spinning blades, like a blender cosplay as a monk. In combat, even if they didn't land a fatal strike, the intimidation factor was off the charts. Imagine facing an opponent with what looked like 2 fiery halos of doom, and you're standing there with a stick. Your brain would be like, nope, not today. So why did they fade away? Because they were impractical. Too much training, too much risk of self-harm, and too little use against people with actual armor. They were more of a show weapon, amazing for intimidation and ceremonial displays, but terrifyingly stupid to actually use in battle. Basically, the wind and firewheels were the nunchucks of ancient China. Iconic, deadly if mastered, embarrassing if you weren't.
Number 5. The Congre rocket.
Now let's talk about fireworks that decided to grow up and get a job in the military. The Congre rocket, early 19th century. Imagine a giant bottle rocket. Except instead of lighting up the night sky at your cousin's barbecue, it was designed to explode in enemy ranks. These rockets were basically long iron tubes packed with gunpowder, mounted on wooden sticks, and launched at a vaguely upward angle. Sounds fine in theory, until you realize in theory is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Congre rockets had all the stability of a shopping cart with 3 wheels. They could soar majestically into the enemy camp, or they could do a U-turn and smack directly into your own soldiers. The British Army loved them anyway. They used them against Napoleon, against American forces in the War of 1812, and against anyone else who annoyed them. But soldiers on both sides quickly learned the truth. Congre rockets were just as dangerous to the guys who launched them. The rockets whistled ominously through the air, sure, but half the time they exploded harmlessly in the mud or landed in a cow pasture. Psychologically, though, they were devastating. Picture being in a battle and suddenly hundreds of flaming projectiles come screeching out of the sky, zigzagging unpredictably. Even if most of them fizzled, the sound alone was pure nightmare fuel. Your brain wouldn't be calculating ballistics, it'd be screaming, "Fire from the sky! Run!" So why were they abandoned? Because when your weapon is scarier than it is effective, it belongs in a circus, not a battlefield. Rockets wouldn't truly become reliable until modern tech caught up. The Congre rocket was the embarrassing teenage phase of missile warfare. Loud, dramatic, acne-ridden, and guaranteed to ruin someone's day. Just not always the right someone.
Number 4. The Davy Crockett nuclear rifle. Yes, you heard that right. In the Cold War, America built a nuclear bazooka. Because apparently someone thought, guns are scary, but what if we put nuclear warheads in the hands of a couple of sweaty infantrymen? This monstrosity was called the Davy Crockett, after the folk hero who allegedly killed him a bear when he was only 3. Subtle, right? The Davy Crockett was a recoilless rifle that could fire a nuclear warhead with an explosive yield of about 10 to 20 tons of TNT. Not kilotons, not megatons, just enough to annihilate a few city blocks. The problem? Its range was so short, soldiers firing it were often within the blast radius. That's right. Congratulations, you just nuked the enemy and yourself. Imagine being the soldier responsible for firing one. You'd be thinking, am I protecting my country or auditioning for a Darwin Award? The weapon was so impractical that troops openly questioned why it even existed. It wasn't a deterrent, it was more like a cosmic joke. The Cold War was full of absurdity, but handing out portable nukes was the military equivalent of giving toddlers scissors and hoping for the best. Psychologically, the Davy Crockett was pure terror. It embodied the nuclear age in the most absurd way possible, the idea that apocalypse could now fit nicely into your backpack. But the fear wasn't just for the enemy. The soldiers holding it knew they were basically signing up for a front row seat to their own funeral. Naturally, it never saw actual combat. It was too terrifying, too dangerous, and too stupid to ever actually use. The Davy Crockett is the forgotten weapon that proves humans are sometimes their own worst threat. When victory means glowing in the dark, maybe just put the bazooka down.
Number 3. The lantern shield. Renaissance Italy gave us many things: beautiful art, scandalous politics, and of course, ridiculous weapons. Enter the lantern shield. Imagine a buckler-sized shield, already small and not particularly useful for, shielding. Now cram a lantern inside it, because obviously what you need in the middle of a sword fight is mood lighting. But wait, there's more. The lantern shield also came bristling with spikes, claws, and even a hidden dagger that could fold out like some kind of medieval Swiss Army knife. The idea was that you'd blind your opponent with the lantern's light, then stab, slash, and claw them with the dozen sharp things welded onto the shield. Sounds genius, right? Except, no. In practice, this weapon was like strapping a junk drawer to your arm. It was heavy, clunky, and required you to juggle way too many mechanics mid-battle. Plus, the lantern itself was fueled by oil and fire, which meant swinging it around in combat turned you into a walking fire hazard. You weren't intimidating your enemy, you were making them wonder how long until you lit yourself on fire. Psychologically, though, it was terrifying to behold. Picture facing an opponent who's waving around a glowing spiked contraption while yelling Italian insults at you. Your brain would short-circuit. Was this guy fighting you or auditioning for a Cirque du Soleil? Either way, you'd be distracted, which was kind of the point. Still, the lantern shield was more of a showpiece than a battlefield staple. Too complex, too dangerous, and too absurd to use effectively, it eventually faded into obscurity. In the end, it was less terrifying weapon of war and more proof that Renaissance inventors sometimes had too much espresso.
Number 2, the hellburner ships. Now, let's talk about weapons that turned entire boats into suicide bombs. During the late 16th century, the Dutch were fighting the Spanish, and someone had the bright idea, what if we just filled a ship with gunpowder and sailed it into the enemy fleet? Thus, the hellburner was born. These weren't just fire ships, those were common. The hellburners were packed with literal tons of explosives, with timers set to ignite once the vessel drifted close enough. If successful, the explosion could wipe out entire squadrons in one go. Terrifying doesn't even begin to describe it. Imagine standing on a deck watching what you think is a harmless, abandoned ship drift closer, for it to erupt into a floating apocalypse. Psychologically, it was devastating. The Spanish Armada developed a kind of collective paranoia every time a derelict ship appeared on the horizon. Is it just an empty vessel, or is it today's ticket to the afterlife? That kind of uncertainty messes with your brain more than actual combat sometimes. So while the hellburners did score some infamous victories, they were never a reliable weapon. Too terrifying, too destructive, and way too risky, they were eventually abandoned. Still, they live on as the maritime equivalent of strapping dynamite to a Roomba and hoping it finds the right room before it explodes.
Number 1, the sun gun. And finally, we arrive at the most insane, most terrifying, and most hilariously impractical forgotten weapon of all, the sun gun. This wasn't a medieval experiment or a Renaissance fever dream. It was a genuine Nazi concept during World War II. The idea? Launch a giant mirror into orbit and use it to focus sunlight into a death ray capable of incinerating entire cities. Yes, really, a space mirror death ray. It was less military strategy and more comic book supervillain audition tape. The Nazis believed that by magnifying solar radiation, they could turn the sky into a weapon. Just point the mirror, cook a city, and boom, instant barbecue. Psychologically, the concept alone was terrifying. Imagine being told the enemy was working on a giant orbital magnifying glass that could literally fry you like an ant on the sidewalk. Even if you never saw it in action, the fear would burrow deep into your brain. Humans are hardwired to fear fire from the sky. It's in our myths, our religions, our nightmares. The sun gun tapped straight into that primal terror. But in reality, it was pure science fiction. The technology to build such a thing didn't exist then and honestly doesn't exist now. The logistics alone, launching massive structures into orbit during a time when rockets could barely reach London, were laughably impossible. Still, the fact that this plan even made it onto a blueprint is proof of just how wild wartime desperation can get. So, the sun gun was never built. Too terrifying in theory, too ridiculous in practice, and too impractical to ever exist outside of pulp novels. But it remains the king of forgotten weapons, the one that perfectly captures humanity's weird mix of genius, insanity, and maybe we've had enough coffee for today. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.